Okay, it's finally time to begin working with orchestrations. Up till now we've been dealing with schemas, maps, and pipelines primarily. And I just wanted to save orchestrations for last because a lot of people, again, assume that BizTalk is only about orchestrations. And we have seen how that we have sent messages through the system using something called content-based routing. And in prior demos we have routed POs based upon the size of the PO without even writing any orchestration. So now we're going to write our first orchestration, and we will put it in a separate project. So we'll say here, add new project, and we'll pick an empty BizTalk project, and we'll call it PO Orchestrations. So in that project, if we're going to use any of our schemas or maps, we'll have to make references to them. So right here we'll click Add Reference, and from here we'll go to our other projects, and for right now I'm going to assume that we might need all three of these other projects. So I'm going to click all three, I'm going to click Add, and then OK. So now you can see here we have the references established. And so now I want to click on the project itself and right click Add New Item, and now we'll pick from the list Orchestrations, BizTalk Orchestration, and notice it's called ODX is the name of the file description, and we will call this PO Demo 1. Actually, I like to call it ORC. Start with the word ORC. PO Demo 1. So this is the orchestration designer screen, and you're going to need your toolbox. Well, there's two ways to add shapes here. You can, for instance, drag and drop a shape from the left side, or you can actually just right click here, like click here and say Insert Shape, and you can add it from a list that appears here. So either way works. I might use this technique just to save more room on my screen. And while we're doing this, again, well, we're going to need the property window quite often. We won't really need Solution Explorer that much. So most orchestrations typically do begin with a receive, and there's a special type of receive called the activating receive, which we'll talk about in just a minute because it's a very common error. So let's just say we're going to do the pretty much a minimal orchestration here. We're going to receive a file, and before we send it though, we will put in here a decide shape. So decide shape will say if the PO is over a certain amount, we'll send it to one place, otherwise we'll send it to another place. So we're going to have two send shapes here. So again, I can either drag or drop from over here. And you can also do maps inside your orchestration, but right now we've been doing all our mapping in our receive port, so at this time we don't actually need a map. So we're going to have a rule here on how to decide where to send the file. So before you can have a receive, notice these shapes all have these little red exclamation points on them. That means they haven't been completed yet. So each shape is going to require a little bit of configuration before we can continue. And so the first shape, and by the way, these port surfaces you can also hide if you need a little bit more room. So what I could do is hide the right one, leave the left one open, and then slide this over a little bit like that. And we need to configure our receive shape. So the first thing you need to do is give it a message. And if you come over here, you'll normally pick a message from a list, but you notice that we've not defined any messages yet. So before you can have a receive or a send shape, you have to have a message. So how do you create a message? You do that here in the orchestration viewer. So here are the basic entities of an orchestration, and you see we have no messages. So we're going to right click New Message, and then we're going to go to our Properties window, and we're going to give it a name. And so my naming convention is I always put it MSG, and then I give it some meaningful name like Standard PON. Okay, and then we give it a message type. The message type is normally going to be a schema. So we're going to go to this list here, and you're going to see it could be a .NET class. It could be a multi-part message, which has to do with web services. Web message types also have to do with web services, but the simple one is schemas. And so right here you have a choice of actually creating a new schema which I almost never do. I always create the schema using the schema editor, and then I always choose this option. Now, if the schemas were actually in the same project as the orchestration, the schemas would appear right here on this list. But normally, I would say the schemas are going to be in a different project. So another project is called a referenced assembly. So you click that, this screen will appear. So we're looking for our schemas. So we either have schemas generated or PO schemas. And since we're going to be dealing with the standard purchase order, that's this schema right here, we just simply double click it, and now that message has been established. You see here the message has no unfinished business about it. There's no red exclamation points or anything. Now we can associate this receive to that message. So here's a list of all your messages, and you can see there's still other things we're going to have to set up, something called an operation, but we'll come back and do that in a minute. Now that we have our message, we might want to have a rule based on that message. So here's our decide shape. And a decide shape, you could say actually here, decide if needs approval or not. Okay? And then you're going to actually type the rule in this little box here called Rule 1. So you open or double click on Rule 1, and then here you're going to type in something about that message. So what I did right there is I typed in one or two letters of the message name, and then I hit Control Space. And this is the IntelliSense feature that Microsoft has in like Visual Studio. And if there were more than one message, if I clicked Control Spacebar here, I would see a list of all the messages, and I could pick one. And then there's two ways to refer to fields inside a message. One is the dot syntax, which we use with what's called a distinguish field. The other way is to put a parentheses here. And remember when we did content-based routing, we said we wanted to route the message based upon the size of the PO. So hang on one sec, let me find where I'm at here. Okay, so the problem is there's no fields here that are promoted. Let me just kind of remind you of something we did in a prior video. It's possible, that you're skipping around these videos and not doing them in the order. So if I go over here to, let me think just a minute, my send ports. We did some filters over here on something called like PO schema out demo large. And we went to the filters, and we said if the PO generated property, and we went to this list, and you see here these two fields, property schema generated, customer number, and total PO amount. Okay, so when we did this demo earlier, we were working with a schema called PO schema generated, and we set up what's called a promoted field. The problem right now is we don't have any promoted fields in our standard PO. So what we're going to have to do before we can actually put a test here to see if a PO amount is over a certain dollar amount, we have to promote that field. So I'm going to cancel out of this, and we're going to go back to our schema. So here we're going to scroll down to the schemas project, find the standard purchase order XSD, and open that. And the symbol for promotion is like a little blue ribbon with a little yellow sticker. And you can see pretty easily here that none of these fields have been promoted. So let's take the total amount, right click, and say promote, show promotion. And we'll click add. I'm sorry, let me do that again. There's two types of promoted fields. If I do promote, quick promote, it will create a property schema, which is actually another special schema. And now it's promoted. And now if we actually open that property schema, it's just going to be called property schema by default. There's always this dummy property here which we can delete, and now there's the PO total amount. And so what that means is that this field will be promoted out of the body of the XML message, and it will be carried around in what's called the context of the message. Now we can promote other fields like the date received and maybe the PO number itself. Now there's another type of field called a distinguished field. So I'm going to do a mixture of both here so that I can show you what the difference is. If we do show promotions, okay, over here we have our property fields, which are our fully promoted fields, and then here you have your distinguished fields. So let's make customer date and PO comment, and one more, the name of the customer here. Those will be, actually let's put both names in here to show that you can actually have both. So these are called distinguished fields. So when I'm done with that, I click OK, and I need to rebuild the schema project. So I do a right click, build, and as soon as that build is done, I'll go back to my orchestration. Now if I go back to this rule and I type in again message, control blank, and I put parentheses, if I drop down to, if I go down to the PO section here, okay, I still don't see my fields. Okay, this is one thing I think, to me, it looks like a bug in BizTalk. Once you've added new promoted fields, you should be able to see them here. And if you can't see them, what I often end up doing is I'll come here and I'll do a remove of the reference, and I'll just re-reference the same project again. It seems like kind of a stupid thing to have to do. So then I come here, I go down to here, and now you can see my promoted fields. So all these little yellow, looks kind of like a little yellow letter, these are the fields that I promoted. So I want to test on the value of the total amount. If that's greater than $1,000, then let's assume that this purchase order needs approval. Now why isn't the greater than sign working? The greater than sign is saying that PO total amount is actually a string. Okay, so I got to go back to my schema. I basically made a mistake there. This PO total amount, the property needs to be a decimal. So again, every time you change this, you'll have to save it, rebuild the project that the schema is in, and once again I'll drop and re-add the reference to that project. Then we go back to the rule now, and we still shows it's a string. So here's another little trick. Okay, the PO total amount, once we promoted it, it actually, the string characteristic got copied into the property schema. So the property schema itself, we have to come here and change it to a decimal as well. So I'll rebuild that project. And one more time we'll drop and re-add the reference here. And now you can see that little squiggly line went away under the greater than. So we now have our if statement correct. And by the way, in this is called the BizTalk expression editor. At the top it gives you examples of how you could, what kind of test you could put here. And there are different types of expression editors. This one is actually a Boolean expression. So anything that evaluates to true or false can be contained in this box. So then if we want to send the identical message that we received, we'll just come here to the send shape and we will pick the same message. And then we'll do the same thing here. And now basically we've written our orchestration except for the ports. So now we have to have ports to be able to tie to our send and receive shapes. So on the port surface we're going to say new configured port. If you just say new port, it'll add the port, but then you have to configure it manually using the properties window. So I prefer to do configured port, and then it will open a wizard, and the wizard will take you through the questions that you need to answer to properly configure the port. So again, you might want to have some kind of naming conventions in mind before you start. We'll call this port receive standard PO, and I think that would be good. And I'm going to copy that because on the next screen you create a port type, and so I might want the same name here, maybe without the word port again. And basically what a type, like in .NET, a type is a class, and then the port would be an object, an instance of that class. For now, we're mostly going to be using one-way ports, and we will just take the default options here. And then here you pick if this is basically a send or a receive. So I'll be receiving messages on this port. And then here, you can either choose specify now, where you actually type in, for instance, the name of the directory you wish to receive from. But I prefer to do specify later, which means you're going to use binding to be able to tie your orchestration to real files. And I think the binding gives you more flexibility in the long term. If you're in a hurry and just doing a demo, sometimes I will do specify now just to get it done quickly. But I think overall you're safer with specify later. And then we'll tell you what direct means in a future video. So I want later. At this point, I'm done with the wizard. And now you can connect the shapes together. So you notice that since this is a receive, it won't connect to a send, but it will connect to a receive. And as soon as I connected that, you notice the little red exclamation point went away. And so now I need two send ports. So I'll say new configured port. And so I'm consistent here. I call this port, how about send, standard PO, no approval. Same thing here except port type underscore. I'm going to do this a little bit faster. This will be a send port, and we'll specify later, and we're done. So that's the no approval. So over here, if it's over $1,000, it needs approval. So this is the approval track. This is the non-approval track. So I'm going to connect that, and then we need one more port here, and we'll call this approval. Take again most of the defaults, except we're going to be a sending port, and then we'll connect this. So at this point we have our orchestration basically done. I want to show you one thing here. These port surfaces can actually be however you want it. So I can actually take a send port on the left side and I can move it to the right side. So you see now it actually looks a little more balanced. But for purposes of the video, I might just keep this port over here and keep this port surface closed just to make more room available on the screen. Now the next thing I need to do is just clean it up a little bit. Like I should put good descriptions on everything. So here on my receive, I want to call it RCV standard PO. And here I want to call it, this is just, I'm changing the name box in the property window, send standard send approval PO, and here we'll say send non-approval PO. Now you notice you only have about, I think it's 15 characters in most of these boxes, and I'll show you some tricks of how you can get around that in a future video. Also on the rule here, instead of just calling it rule 1, let's call this POs over $1,000. So I know there's going to be a compile error when I compile this, but at this point I want to do a build and show you what happens. So the build is running. And that was real time. I kept the video running the whole time. I sort by errors here, and this is a very common error that I still make it today quite often. It says you must specify at least one already initialized correlation set for non-activation receive that is on a non-self-correlating port. Now to me that's a very cruel error to give to a beginner, and eventually you'll understand what it means. Simply put, what it says is that you have a receive here, and that receive has no correlation on it. Okay, and correlation is a kind of an advanced topic we'll talk about later. So it says here you must specify at least one already initialized correlation set for non-activating receive that is on a non-self-correlating port. So what that means is if you don't have correlation, you have to have an activating receive. So an activating receive is a receive that will actually start the orchestration. So in other words, basically what it's telling you is your first receive needs to be a special receive that actually triggers the entire orchestration to start running. And that will actually create a subscription in the subscription database. So the way you do that is you click on the receive, and over here you have this little property called activate, and you should set it to true. Now it seems like if the designers of this product were maybe a little smarter, they would always set the first receive to true, and that would make life easier for beginners. But you're going to have to remember to do that. So now we're going to go back up here to our project, and we're going to build it again, and it should compile successfully. Now we can't deploy it yet because we're going to need a strong name key file for it. So we're going to go to right click properties, go down to our build, and this is the same thing we did on our schema projects and so on. Actually here on assembly we want to click to the key name file. That's the name of it. And the other thing we need to do is put our application name in here on the deployment screen. So if I go over here, the name of my application is Purchase Order App. Make sure I spell it the same. Okay, at this point I'm ready to deploy and test, but I will actually do that in the next video.